a number of you have had questions about or related to mind reading. And so I want to just stress one thing before looking at a couple particular questions. Um, Nagel isn't saying that the knowledge that we gain through intuitive reasoning is better or more certain in some way than knowledge that we gain through reflective reasoning. It's not about our knowledge at all, this mind reading stuff she's talking about. The importance of mind reading for her is that when we think about other people or about hypothetical cases, we make intuitive judgments about whether they know, they have knowledge or not. And these intuitive judgments, she thinks, are instances of mind reading. We are making judgments, they're intuitive judgments about what's going on in other people's minds. That's why it's called mind reading. We're making judgments about whether they know. And so it's not about our own knowledge and whether this is intuitive or not. It's about our intuitive judgments about their knowledge. That's the role mind reading is playing. And this is she thinks these cases are instances of mind reading. And she thinks this doesn't vary across cultures. And it's why she thinks that these can play a good role in epistemology, like in Gettier cases or in the zebra case. Okay, here's a particular question somebody asked. I wanted to ask how Nagel would respond to the result in the podcast that Josh Knope talks about, that women had very different intuitions from men on certain matters. Does that mean those experiments were flawed in some way? Is it impossible that there are truly different intuitions across genders? I think this is a good question. I think Nagel would say, for the purposes of what she's arguing in her paper, that it depends on whether these intuitions are instances of mind reading. So Nagel isn't claiming in this paper that there are no possible variations in intuitive judgments. She's simply saying that in cases of mind reading, there aren't these variations. So if there are differences in intuitive judgments about, say, what's the right thing to do in a particular situation, or about whether a particular contradiction can be true, we have intuitive judgments, it seems, about these things. These are not instances of mind reading. When I'm asked about a particular example, did the person do the right thing? Or when I'm asked, is this contradiction true? I'm not being asked to mind read. Where if I'm being asked, does this person know? I am asked to mind read. And so the fact that there might be variation in a bunch of cases where we make intuitive judgments doesn't show that her claim about epistemology particularly is wrong, since these other cases involving ethics or logic or maybe metaphysics aren't instances of mind reading. That said, it would be interesting. I think it's an interesting result if intuitions are okay to use in epistemology because they're mind reading intuitions, and those are not varied across cultures. But intuitions about ethics or something are. That would be sort of a split result for philosophy. Some of the things we do in philosophy when we use intuition seem to be okay. Some of them we do in philosophy when we use intuition seem to not be okay. That would be very interesting. And I think that's sort of the state of the field right now. 10 or 15 years after these papers were written, people are trying to figure out which results are replicable, which results are theoretically grounded, and which of our intuitions are reliable and which aren't. Somebody else says, I would argue that mind reading is quite different than making intuitive judgments toward hypothetical cases. Though both are supposed to be spontaneous, automatic processes, it seems that mind reading is far more of an unconscious process than what is used to measure our intuitive judgments on Gettier cases. I believe that our genuine intuition should be taken into consideration for epistemic theorizing, but these hypotheticals are so disconnected from reality, especially in comparison to the practice of social mind reading, that I wonder whether our judgments here are even capable of being solely and authentically intuitive. I think this is an interesting point. I don't have a response to this. This is just to say, look, this person's saying, look, Nagel might be right about mind reading, that it doesn't vary across culture and it will really help us in doing epistemology. But when we get into outlandish cases like Gettier cases, or maybe the clairvoyance cases, or maybe cases like those involving the zebra at the zoo or the cleverly painted mule, those are such weird cases, and they're not found in a natural situation that we're not truly doing mind reading. I think it's an interesting point and an open question. Finally, somebody says, In Weinberg, Nichols, and Stitch's piece, they comment on Nisbet and Haidt's research that notes that there are major cognitive differences between Westerners and others in things like perception, attention, and memory. How could the mind reading process that relies so heavily on these cognitive processes not be different across Western and other cultures? Again, I think this is really interesting. I don't have a good response to this. One thing I will say is that some of this work of Nisbet and Haidt has been challenged in recent years, as much of the work in social psychology has been challenged in recent years, and we'll probably talk more about this on Wednesday in class. But this is a good question. It's an empirical one, to the sense insofar as we wonder whether Nisbet and Haidt are correct in noting that there are these great differences. And then there's a conceptual issue. Could it be that there are all these differences, but in mind reading, there aren't differences across cultures? I think that would be, it's possible, but it depends a lot on the details. And that sort of relies on more psychology than we have access to.